And now, of course, the real work is starting. And we are supposed to go into the various forms of election systems, electoral systems, to go to practice. In fact, I had to think at that time the days when George Bush said he was going to bring democracy to Iraq. And in UNU, we immediately responded, what kind of democracy does he mean? Because there are many different types of democracy, and until now, in fact, all the speakers have talked about democracy as if it is a well-known thing. Everyone does the same. That is not the case. And that's what we have to talk about and think about, because not every system of democracy is adequate for every society. And also there will be growth over time, and we will see it. So there are different questions on the table when you talk about different systems of democracy. The first question is, who has the right to vote? Because when you talk about democracy, it's about the people, the rule of the people for the people, to benefit the people. That's the basic idea. The rule of the people. And the elections have to play a role there, because how do you know what the people want? So that's one thing. But the rule of the people for the people. But then it is important when there are elections, who is voting? Now, normally you would say every citizen can vote. And there are conditions under which the population register is so weak that you cannot count on the reliability of the population register. In that case, people have to register for elections. But there are other places where people have to register for elections anyway. That can only be a vicious method to exclude people from voting. No? And very often I just say it in a cruel manner so that you realize yourself what's really happening. To exclude people from voting, like many in the southern states of the US. How come so many of the southern states are still voting Republican? Because those who would like to vote the Democratic Party are not registered. So, vote. Who has the right to vote? That's one. Then a second one is, do you have a presidential system or a parliamentary system? Of course, the parliamentary system can have a president, but then it's a symbolic president, like in Germany. And basically, it's the parliament that decides who is the prime minister. But in a presidential system, like in France or in the US, it's the president who appoints the prime minister to find the other ministers for his cabinet. It's the president chairing the Council of Ministers, which is a completely different pattern, where in the other case, where it is rather a symbolic head like a king or a queen. So, presidential system. Do you have indirect elections, regional, where in fact the regional representatives then choose? Like in the case when Bush was elected, he had minus 1 million votes nationwide compared to Gore. So everyone was focusing on what happened in Florida, was completely irrelevant. He had 1 million votes less nationwide. But because of the distribution of the votes over the different districts, Bush was then did become the president. So is it indirect, regional? Is it national? Is the outcome proportional? This all creates different parliaments, different systems, different institutions, different outcomes in democracy. Then is it a multi-party system where you always need coalition governments, or is it a two-party system, which has the major negative side effect that all issues become black and white. You are either for or against. Whereas modern society is a very complex society. And most solutions are somewhere in the middle. But in a binary system, that's a very difficult thing to sell. No? So that's the other point. Is it, what kind of a system is it? Do you have a threshold? Yes or no, when you have a multi-party system, where you at least have, let's say, 5% of the votes have to go to the party, otherwise the party will not be represented in the parliament. Otherwise, people say there is so much fragmentation. Well, people are also afraid that when there is too much fragmentation, that is very unclear what kind of decision-making, decisions take too long. But you can ask yourself the question in the present-day society, which is very complex, whether that is a major problem. Because not the decision-making is the problem, the implementation. You can have quick decisions, but implementations that take very long. Why? Because the one taking the decisions is very lax in realizing, in implementing, but also because it's a complex society. When the large majority of the people don't like the decision, they just send it to the machine, and it takes very long before the decision can be implemented, really. So that's also a major, major problem. So the Belgian government, there's another question, is it a very centralized system or a decentralized system? I can tell you the Belgians were very happy when they had no national government. They don't need it because they have a government of Flanders and a government of Wallonie. The national government is almost doing nothing. For me, the major surprise was I was in Tokyo for UNU. I came into the Belgian embassy, and then there was a very well-seasoned Belgian ambassador, and he had a very young fellow from Flanders next to him. Why? Because the money for development cooperation was with Flanders, was not at the Belgian level. So what are the domains of authority? It's not just which institutions, how do you vote for the institutions, but then what are the domains of authority of the institutions? So, for instance, the federal government in Washington in relation to the government in the different states. Or when you are in a country like the Netherlands, or where you have a national government and then you have provincial governments, the distribution of powers, of authority, the domains are very different. So I will stop here because we have 4 excellent speakers, and I just would like to mention a few topics of this whole question. What is this democracy actually? And how is it different in different countries, what people are doing? The first speaker is Ismail Sergeldin, and I don't have to introduce him.
Thank you very much, Hans, and thank you all for being here again. And I'd like to also express deep thanks for those who made it. And Gary Jacobs just arrived in time, and some of our colleagues are still trying to come, but they hopefully will be there in time for their sessions later on today. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me start very quickly because we should have no more than 15 minutes per person, and then 15 minutes for response from the floor. First of all, I'd like to say that this is a special anniversary for democracy. It's exactly 800 years since the Magna Carta, which is counted as one of the founding documents of democracy, where the barons of England forced King John to accept that his rule was not absolute. That document remains the inspiring document for a lot of Anglo-Saxon, if not all of Western views of democracy and where it was founded. Today, or tomorrow to be precise, is the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 10th of December. And that's not all. A very special thanks, of course, to Gunnar Stalset, because it's also the Nobel Peace Prize, with which he has been involved for many years. So the fact that he honors us here today is something that is worthy of a very special thanks for Gunnar to be here today. And we are waiting to see, of course, what happens in the various Nobel Prizes around the world, but it's important. So what are the milestones of democratic evolution? There is a very nice exhibition right next to you here, which I hope you will visit, because we have been talking mostly about the West, but I would like to talk about the East also, and the East starts for us in the Muslim world with the Constitution of Medina, 66 articles, in which the Prophet Muhammad, when he came to Medina, established coexistence with the various participants in Medina, what the rights and obligations would be. Then there is the Contract of Omar, which he signed with various cities, which Muslims took over, including Jerusalem, where he said the Christians will run their own affairs, they will keep their churches, they will not be forced to fight in the Muslim armies, etc., etc. There, he was told, I mean, remember, we're talking 7th century, 640 AD. The patriarch was so taken by the generosity of the act that he asked him to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he refused. And they asked him, why don't we pray to the same God? He said, yes, but if I pray in your church, my followers will turn it into a mosque. So he prayed across the street, and today in Jerusalem, that's where the Mosque of Omar stands. So it was very prescient on his part. There is Omar's letter to the Qadi, which talks about the presumption of innocence and other things of that nature, which is remarkably modern, but that's a discussion for another day. And throughout the Middle Ages, of course, in the Muslim world, we had enormous tolerance. Remember Andalusia, where the great Jewish philosopher Maimonides flourished, and so did many Christian scholars and so on. Akbar and the Mughals in India had special prescriptions to ensure the rights of minorities, including others. And even in the Ottoman Empire, there was the Majlis al-Milli. In Egypt, this is our milestones. We started our democratic experience in 1866. Majlis Shura al-Nawab under Khedive Ismail, who is famous for inaugurating the Suez Canal, but they should also remember that he was also the person who abolished slavery, among other things, within a year of the same time as the United States, the 13th Amendment of the United States. Then we had the Constitution of 1923, the Revolution of 1952, the 1971 Constitution, amendments to that, the short-lived, thank God, Constitution of 2012, and the Constitution of 2014, for whom we have to thank Mr. Amr Moussa, who was the chair of the commission who actually drafted that resolution, that constitution. And these milestones are all there. But we tend to talk more of Western models of democracy. And we talk about Athens as the birthplace of democracy. Well, what actually most people don't seem to know is that in Athens, democracy was very limited, not only to a very few people, but actually that they used a system of lottery. This needs to be better known. They used a system of lottery, and that's why we will hear later on in this conference about what is the modern word for it, sortition, as a system that allows alternatives to what needs to be said. So they had I won't go through the Athenian democracy because I don't have time for that. Briefly, there were the Renaissance republics in Italy, which we know about. Then, of course, the great movement of the Enlightenment in Europe, and the history of modern democracy starts, surprisingly, not with the American and French revolutions, but the British Revolution. I don't know how they managed, our British friends, to get dropped out of all the accounts, as if all the blood and war and so on was elsewhere, and that in England it was always a country of laws. It wasn't. Charles I confronted Oliver Cromwell. There was an English civil war, which lasted about 10 years. At the Battle of Naseby after 1649, they executed their king. So when you talk to most people, they forget that Charles I was the first regicide in Europe, as opposed to talking about, oh, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were executed. Well, 100 years before, the British had done that as well. But the English Bill of Rights also was a precursor, 1689, and later on, the French would be inspired by that, so would the Americans. So the democratic surge comes with the Declaration of Independence in the United States, which not only, I mean, there's a very beautiful analytical work, this as a librarian now, on the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson had written subjects, and he scratched out the word subjects and wrote citizens. They were no longer subjects of the crown. They were citizens of the state. Now, this is a very simple word change, but it's a very profound word change in what it means, and that it was a universal declaration. And then later on, the Constitution of the United States, to which the Bill of Rights was the first 10 amendments, which we all know. The French Revolution came shortly on the heels of the American Revolution, and they also had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in 1789, with the slogan that we all know. And these are some of the things that appear in the French Declaration of the Rights of Citizen, the man and citizen. And we can say that this continued, and the peak of that came after the Second World War with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as I said, was the 10th of December, 1948. And by the start of the 21st century, democracy was gaining everywhere, notably in Latin America and in Eastern Europe and in Africa. And so, what were the steps towards democracy? Well, first was limiting the absolute rights of the monarch. That's what, after all, the Magna Carta stands for. Then guaranteeing some fundamental rights to the subjects, creating a social contract between government and governed, limiting the powers of government, separation of powers, Montesquieu, 1749, and then legitimacy of the government comes from the consent of the governed, and the voice of the sovereign people is represented by an elected government, and the right to participate in electing that government was the privilege of the few initially, and then we expanded suffrage until we reached universal suffrage. That's pretty much how the model of practical democracy as we know it. So to repeat, this is really what we want. I said that in the prologue: freedom, justice, equality, etc., etc. And we believe democracy will deliver this. And these are the three questions I said at the beginning. We should not confuse the means, which is elections, with the results, which are the desired outcomes. And we should be able to think about better instruments to deal with that. Now, there's also been the issue of how do you move from where you are, not in several hundred years or 1,000 years, but in fairly quickly. Latin America has done a remarkable job. In the 1980s, pretty much all the continent was transformed from military dictatorships to democracies. But it doesn't always go that way. There are all sorts of problems. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's been a lot of democratic movements in Eastern Europe. Some countries succeeded brilliantly, some did not. And some fell into what the economists call this roundabout, where a government is toppled, the new people inherit the divided country, new government make progress, et cetera, and then they end up always coming back again to restart. So what are the challenges of alternative models from the East that we're heading today? Well, China. They have a system for people changing, so they change their presidents every 10 years. Every 5 years, you have pretty much the 5 top runners, you know who they are. But it's opaque and certainly is not transparent and is not our understanding of how a democratic system works, but they have a system that works for them. Singapore, enormous success. Who can deny the enormous success of Singapore in everything? But it is not, again, a traditional democratic system. But other places have no democracy and no progress due to quasi-feudal elites. And I have to, Afghanistan being one of them. My friend and colleague Ashraf Ghani is now president there. We worked together in the World Bank for many years. But he has a very difficult time. So there's also the role of charismatic leaders in helping these transitions. Aung San Suu Kyi, who just now, after 20 years in jail, is becoming the real democratic leader. I had the privilege of knowing these two giants who engineered the transformation of South Africa from apartheid to democracy. And Desmond Tutu, as we are the rainbow people, as you know, he handled that extremely difficult Commission on Reconciliation and Truth, or Truth and Reconciliation. And we really feel the passing of a giant in the case of Nelson Mandela. Obasanjo, who was going to be with us the morning here, he was initially a military leader, ruled the country, resigned, came back, was re-elected later on, and was active in civil society as well. So we have had difficulties applying the lessons of the democracy, old and new, that has developed over time to see where we go from here. What are the current problems? Alienation of citizens, representation, effectiveness is very problematic. So you see low participation rates, low membership in parties, and of course, money and corruption. Money, you need $1 billion to run for president in the United States. So it's just beyond belief, the amount of money you have. There's the issues of polarization and deadlock. You mentioned that Belgium, 521 days without a government, longest period anywhere. which led to the Belgian Academy, of which I'm a member, producing this book, La démocratie enrayée, which means the blocked democracy. And David Van Raybroek, who is here with us and will be speaking later in this conference, who wrote this magnificent book called Against the Elections. Generally speaking, we can see almost everywhere there's been voter turnout at parliamentary elections going down, and party membership is going down in every place. And the worrying general trend of decline of voter turnout is both in the United States and in Europe. If you look at the US presidential elections, they went from 90% to 66%. If you look at the congressional turnouts, they're less than the presidential turnouts, but they end up at 42%. Membership affiliation, today, independents in the United States are higher than Democrats and Republicans. This is an observed phenomenon, which was not the case before. Parliamentary elections in Europe also show a decline, maybe not as marked, but 93 to 74, 80 to 55, 86 to 71, and a decline in the parliamentary elections for the European Parliament as well, while there is an increase in mistrust as measured by polls. And party membership trends in Europe have declined dramatically. This is anywhere from minus 30 to minus 60% in all of Europe. Trade union membership, which used to be a key tool of bringing the underprivileged into the system and brought the 30, 40-hour week, as you can see, but they've dropped everywhere. Just how serious these drops are, United Kingdom, from 50 to 25% of the labor, which is a 50% decrease, and in the United States from 20 to 11%, which is a 50% decrease. So people feel that they do not have proper means to express themselves, they don't feel that their elected representatives do this effectively for them, and as a result they reclaim the streets in Europe, from Occupy Wall Street to the Arab Spring. This is right here in Alexandria, in front of the library. People couldn't find their way, but they expressed themselves in front of this is in the Corniche here in Alexandria, a little bit west of the library, but they protected the library as well, as we can see here. So what we need really is to move from representative democracy to participatory democracy, a point that Ayman al-Sayyad would be very pleased to note. And to do this, we need the role for NGOs, which are not political parties, which are not officially listed as part of the machinery in the Constitution, but they are powerful agents of change. And Putnam did pioneering work on Italy to try to understand why the North was rich and the South was poor, why the North was more civic and the South was less civic. Is it because that they're rich that they spend more time drinking their cappuccinos? Well, because it was Italy, he could go back to the statistics to 1900s, 1970s, and that work was done in the 1990s. So he tested all the relationships like this, and the results, as you can see, the thickness of the arrows represents the strength of the relationship. So it's very clear that civic organizations have a major role to play. Now, I won't go into the problems of social choice, but Mr. Chairman, if you'll give me 60 seconds more, I would like to point out that sometimes there is no rational decision that is possible by any system of voting. So stop for a parable, the flute and the children, which I owe to Amartya Sen. You meet these three children and they have a flute, and they ask you to assign the flute to one of them. So this one says, I'm a very poor kid. I have no toys at all. These two are very rich kids. They have all sorts of toys. So you give it to him. Now sort of rewind, go back again, same situation. And the girl says, I'm the only musician. These two guys simply blow on it like a whistle. I play beautiful music. They enjoy listening to me. And therefore, I should have the flute. And you say, yeah, makes sense. Again, rewind. What do you get? The third guy says, he's poor, she's a musician, but I made the flute. I took the reed and I made holes in it and I adjusted it. So what do you mean give it to them? So you have, again, a very logical reason. Now, what we have here is what we would term in our political science econometric work as equity, utility, and entitlement. There's no right answer. But what happens is that society at certain moments in time will give an edge to one over the other. As a view, for example, when you give a quota. In Egypt in the 1950s, they gave a quota to the peasants and workers. People talk about a quota for women, we talk a quota for minorities, etc. affirmative action programs for blacks in the United States. So which one of these is right? It depends at what time. And there has to be an ability to discuss this in society in order to arrive at a consensual position that makes sense for the world. And so building and maintaining that requires general agreement on the criteria of choice. How do we change that? Well, there are some positions. There's a whole couple of sections devoted to the idea of sortition. And the idea of sortition is that if you have a parliament that is not representative, perhaps the best way to do that is to take a lottery. Those who doubt, just a second, think about it. The most representative sample of a population is a random sample. And there is a history of that being done with the juries. If you're willing to put a man's life in the hands of 12 people he doesn't know, well, how do juries account for their actions? They're not accountable to a constituency, but they're accountable to principle. And generally, they take their work seriously. So this is a proposal that you'll find in both Terry Borisis's work and David Railbrook's book about take a lottery, choose an agenda council. These people will sit together, put the priorities, and then go home. No elections, no money on elections. Nobody can be bribed because you don't know who's going to win. You don't have to worry about incumbency because the statistical possibilities of somebody being reappointed is almost nil. Then, once having done that, you go to people who are interested, who will prepare proposals. These are reviewed and written up as laws with proposals. And then you have another jury that is again selected by lottery. And this group, by lottery, then listens only to a debate around each of the motions under the supervision of a judge. And then they vote yes or no. No speeches, no speechifying, and they vote yes or no, so it'll be very efficient. And at the end of it, they go home. So again, you don't have the problem of being bribed or not because you don't know who they will be, and they don't stay after they finish their role. So there are other things that can be added to that. But the proposals there show that they do meet the criteria of effective participation, enlightened understanding, control of the agenda, and voting equality, and inclusiveness, which are the 5 rules that Robert Dahl did for the problems of defining a democracy. And so I think we dare to dream here, and we should be bold, because I think the 21st century is the dawn of a new age. We have a new generation that is totally connected, thinks differently, and we have to learn to collaborate in pluralism for the future generation and for the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, someone has to organize the lottery. The discussion will follow later, but I would like to give the floor to the only one on the table who is studying democracy, Anna Luhrmann. And Anna Luhrmann was a parliamentarian herself, and then she moved to Sudan. And she was working there. She even got her master's degree from a Sudanese university. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today. And let me share with you some of the research findings that the project that I worked for has recently come up with. We are a new research institute that is called the Varieties of Democracy Institute, and we have a different approach to studying and measuring democracy. We conceptualize democracy as having different important aspects, for example, electoral, but also participatory, deliberative, egalitarian, and liberal types of democracy. And we offer for scholars and practitioners across the world alike, we offer over 400 different data points on exactly all different aspects of democracy. So it will be better possible than ever before to study how democracy evolves and what it also causes. So I invite you from starting in January to make access of this great resource, and I'm very happy that we have a collaboration with the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, because I feel that the kind of data that we bring forward to the world now is something like adding a big shelf in a library that is open for everyone to use. I was asked here today to say something specifically about the different electoral systems in established democracies. And I'm very happy about this opportunity because many people often say, oh, democracy is a Western concept, right? It's a Western notion. But I think just if you look at the different types of electoral systems that exist in Western countries, you know that there's no single Western notion of democracy. And I think understanding this also helps to understand that, that democracy rests in these different values, in these different dimensions that I've just highlighted, that can be adapted to different cultural contexts across the world. So let me briefly go into the electoral systems. First, as you all know, we have majoritarian electoral systems, we have proportional electoral systems, and mixed electoral systems. And our data set now allowed us to look at the choice of electoral systems that countries have made across the world from 1900 to 2012. And what I found actually quite surprising is that the share of countries that went for majoritarian or proportional electoral systems is almost the same. It's both at around 42%, and around 16% went for mixed electoral systems. And if you only look at established democracies, then you find only 1/3 of countries that went for majoritarian electoral systems. So here you have a slight, the more democratic systems have more proportional election systems. So what are the disadvantages and advantages of the different electoral systems? First, as you know, and as you also briefly touched upon, Mr. Chair, the majoritarian electoral systems, often also called the first past the poll system, has several disadvantages that are easy to grasp. I mean, you spoke about the number of votes that are lost in a typical American elections, right? Because voters vote for candidates in their constituencies, and only the candidate with the most with the most votes gets sent to Parliament or to the Electoral College, and all the other votes are basically not counted, and those votes are not represented. And this can indeed lead to a not very representative Parliament and election outcome. There are some ways of fixing this, for example, a 2-round system, so where you have a first round of election and a second round of election, and then at least it is assured that the winner gets really the majority of the votes and not only a part of the votes. The other disadvantage is that the majoritarian electoral system is very prone for manipulation. You've probably, you might have seen before slides about how easy it actually is to manipulate the sizes of the constituencies so that you can either include more or less people that are likely to support one party, right? So just by gerrymandering, exactly. That's the technical term for it. So it's actually, that's also one of the reasons why in the US and in many other countries, actually slicing the constituencies is a very contested topic. So you can actually have the same number of votes and still have a very different parliament depending on how you shape the constituencies. So these two are the obvious disadvantages of that system. But then I also, for fairness reasons, I also have to say, of course, there are advantages. You normally end up with very clear blocks in the parliament. If you have a majoritarian system, you normally have 2 parties who make it to the parliament, like in the US and the United Kingdom. And this makes it relatively easy to form a government. So a situation like in Belgium, where you had so many different small parties that couldn't agree on forming a government, is less likely to appear in a context with a majoritarian electoral system. And plus, what I also saw in my work across the world, that majoritarian systems actually have the advantage that they promote a clear link between the person who's elected and the constituency. If you have a proportional system with party lists, and then you sometimes find members of parliament who are sent to the capital and don't really know to which constituency they are talking to. I saw that problem in Libya, for example, directly after the first elections in 2012, that there were several people elected on party lists and didn't actually really know to which region and how to report back to them. Okay, so that's definitely one disadvantage. One clear advantage of the majoritarian system. The proportional system, again, has several advantages. Number one, that the votes are really, it's more representative, because also people who vote for a small party find their votes represented in parliament. And then we have new studies now that came in that also countries that use a proportional voting system are less prone to corruption. Because the people who are elected on a party list are less likely to fight for their individual seat, and hence accept need, for example, to do fundraising to finance their own very expensive election campaign in a constituency. So there are less incentives also to manipulate, because you can never manipulate the election enough to win for the overall party. So these are some advantages of the proportional system. There is a disadvantage that it might be complicated in forming a government. But maybe this can be weighed by the advantage that these kind of systems tend to be more inclusive, and particularly for very fragmented societies. You actually find that also people who belong to a minority group are represented in parliament, and hence might support the political order actually more. So now, I know the question that is all on your mind now, what does this scholar tell us? Which one is actually the best electoral system? And I'm going to give you a very typically academic answer, even though in my former life I used to be a politician. I have to say it depends. It really depends on the local context, on the country, on which electoral system is the best. Because the magic, for me, the magic of democracy is that there's consensus about the rules and disagreement about political outcomes and fights about the political outcomes, right? So for me, the essence of democracy is what the great scholar Przeworski wrote down, right? So it's that we have rule certainty and outcome uncertainty. And if there is a consensus about the rules of the game, so for example about the electoral system that everybody accepts as legitimate, then people are more likely also to accept the government, to accept peaceful turnovers in power. And hence, it really depends on the local context and on skillful negotiation and transition processes to find an electoral system that fits to the needs and includes all relevant elements of the society. And that really, as I said, depends on the tradition, what people are used to for elections. I, for example, maybe also because I grew up in Germany, I have a strong preference for a mixed electoral system, so where we combine elements of the proportional list vote with the majoritarian vote in a constituency, but this is definitely also shaped by the fact that this is what the system that I was socialized in. And then also looking at our new data now that we have for elections across the world, we can not only look at what kind of electoral systems there are, but we can also look at the quality of elections, because we've asked independent experts from across the world that are based actually in these countries. And we've asked them how free and fair elections were. And we've also asked them if the loser of an election accepted the outcome, right? And I mean, that's the key that what we all want, right? We want, I mean, I see you nodding coming from Libya. That's the key. And as I said again, the magic of democracy. The magic of democracy is that the loser accepts defeat, the loser's consent, as there also is a famous book out there. That's the magic. And our research shows that actually losers are more likely to accept defeat if elections are free and fair. So we actually, in the category of elections that were held in the last 120 years, that were can be categorized as free and fair, all losers of elections accepted the results. Yeah. So this, I think, is a clear message. And when I say here free and fair, I don't only mean that the ballots are counted correctly on election day, but freedom and fairness of the election also refers to the atmosphere before and after the conduct of elections. Before the conduct of elections, it's about freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of all these basic freedoms. And I think if you have to be afraid to go to jail because you wear a T-shirt that somebody doesn't like, then I think it's quite clear that elections cannot be conducted in a free and fair atmosphere, right? So for elections to be free and fair, they also have to be meaningful. So it has to be clear that those who are elected also hold the real power in the country. And if these criteria are fulfilled, as I said, then the magic of democracy can work, and then also it's very likely that losers accept the outcome of the elections. And as some of the earlier speakers have touched upon, there are several problems with elections in established democracies. Our distinguished host has talked about the problems of finances in politics, and I agree with you that this is a severe problem, particularly in the American democracy. But I don't think it's a problem of democracy as such, because there are ways of solving it. There can be very clear rules and regulations of how to finance political parties, what the cap is for financing campaigns. Or, for example, as we have in Germany, there can even be a state mechanism where weaker political parties get some funds from the government actually to run election campaigns in order to have a more level playing field. So there are ways of dealing with these kind of problems. The second problem that particularly the earlier speaker from the Club de Madrid from Spain touched upon, the performance of elected leaders. And I have to admit that, of course, this is a problem. But particularly if you look at the economic crisis in Europe. But on average and across the history from 1900 to 2012, our research now shows that actually democracy, and particularly electoral democracy actually, is associated clearly with a higher level of human development. And our scholars have now employed really some of these really fancy regression techniques that I don't want to bother you with, but they can really, statistically, they can really clearly determine that the causal link goes from electoral democracy to human development and not the other way around. So if you have a democratic system, there are several incentives for rulers to actually also perform well, in the sense that it's good, for example, for lowering infant mortality, for increasing economic growth and these kind of things. And that's clearly what comes out of our research. And I would also, maybe I won't touch upon China, because then I would talk for another 10 minutes. So that's to the topic of the performance of elected leaders. The third problem that has been often touched upon, the participation of citizens in between elections, or in general, the participation of citizens in established democracies, right? And here I want to share with you just very briefly a story from Germany, actually, and also touching upon my early life as a politician. So basically, before I was born in Germany in the 60s and 70s, some of you might remember, we had a very prominent student movement, right? Coming more from the leftist side. And some of them actually turned violent. I don't know how much that is still in the memory. In Germany, it's very much in the memory. The so-called Rote Armee-Fraktion. Those were some leftist terrorists that actually killed 34 people between the 70s and 80s. And the reaction was very much from the conservative side. There were a lot of people who said, okay, now this is all the student movement, all the leftists are our enemy now, and we have to fight them because they are the ones who lead this kind of terrorism. So there was a strong movement actually to restrict civil liberties and political rights. But luckily, those people who were in favor of this kind of movement did not win. It was still possible to continue to organize themselves for these student movement leaders. And then those of them who renounced violence, who were against these terrorist extremists, they actually turned to the established political process and formed a political party. In the year that I was born, in 1983, they formed the Green Party in Germany, right? One of the founding members was Joschka Fischer. I'm sure some of you in the room had the pleasure of meeting him during the last years. And he was basically, he came from the same socioeconomic group in Germany in the 60s and 70s that also bred these terrorist groups, right? But he and some others decided to go into the system to try to change the system from within. They formed this political party, the Green Party, and exactly because of a lot of the things that Professor Ismail mentioned in his speech, the discontent with the way traditional political parties function, that we need more participation from below, that we need participatory opportunities for young people. So when I started high school and thought about many problems that I saw in the performance of politicians, yeah, in my surroundings, I actually thought, okay, there's a party there that I can join, that welcomes me as a young person, and where I can start working with others to change things from within. So I was 13 years old when I joined this political party, and the Green Party, and I was actually treated with respect, even though I was a lot younger than many other people active there. And then when I was 13, I was offered the opportunity, when I was 19, I was offered the opportunity to run for the elections. And I think that serves as an inspiration for people in Germany, but also across the world. I've traveled to many countries, that actually in functioning democracies, it is possible for young people to participate in the formal political processes. It is possible to change them from within if they allow for reform, these institutions, right? Hence, to come to a close, for me, it is quite clear that democracy is more than elections, yeah? But then at the same time, there are no democracies without free and fair elections. And in the end, if you want to guarantee basic human rights, there's no country, also that's again what our data shows, there's no country in the history of the world that did not have elections and that has guaranteed basic human rights. Yeah? Freedom from torture, for example, freedom of assembly, these are all rights that were only guaranteed in the history of the world in countries that have held elections. Maybe in the future that's different, we'll see. But until now, the proof has to be made that there are other instruments that can help to guarantee this possible. And then the second concluding remark that I want to make is that free and fair elections can ensure that the desire for change finds a peaceful outlet if they allow for reform, if they allow for funding new parties, for selecting new leaders. Hence, true democracies are open for criticism and reform and are able to adapt to the new challenges that also established democracies face now. And I think this is how we can make democracy work in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think a very important thing is here that losers have to accept the fact that they have lost. But they will do so more when there is respect for the others. No, only when there's respect for all these citizens. And so an election can never lead to the rule of the 51%. They always have to take into account what the others want as well when they take their decisions. So democracy is really about maturity. And that also means participation often comes because citizens are not interested in the overall, the big questions in the parliament. They are interested in issues that relate directly to them. And then the people in government should be outgoing enough, should really look after inclusiveness. And that's where you find the participation of the people, when they can be involved in specific issues. Next speaker, Mr. Likotal. He went in the Soviet Union through this democratization process. He is now the president of Green Cause, and he was the spokesman of President Gorbachev. So, Mr. Likotal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be here. The subject of the panel is framing the issue, and inevitably it comes the question, which issue? What do we call the issue? I think the issue is that even a couple of years ago, democracy was one of the most successful, most encouraging, and most promising ideas of the 20th century. And then suddenly, it went somewhere on the verge of the new millennium, it ran into the difficulties. The last upbeat report by the Freedom House was in the year 2000. At that time, Freedom House classified 120 countries to be democratic. That meant at that time 63% of the world total. Since that time, democracy has experienced not just a few setbacks. There are a lot more problems that cannot be listed as just exceptions. What has happened during that period that created these shocks for democratic development? I think this is the biggest issue. So in my contribution, I want to say a couple of words about the reasons of the crisis of democracy, and then what can we expect in the future. According to the usual explanations by the Western writers of democracy, it is a model which has been very attractive because democracies are, on average, richer than non-democracies, less likely to go to war, and have a better record of fighting corruption. More fundamentally, democracy lets people speak their minds and shape their own and their children's future. Then my question, why is the crisis? What has changed? All is still there. Democratic countries are richer, as they were, more stable, as they were, less corrupt, and more viable. Why the crisis then? The answer is that democracy is not only about how people live. It is also about what they live for. It's about human dignity, self-esteem, meaningfulness, sense of fulfillment. It's about values. First time when I thought about that, it was almost 50 years ago. It was another spring, which was called at that time Prague Spring, when in 1968, Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact has invaded Czechoslovakia and abruptly stopped the reforms there. And I will never forget the feeling of shame, helplessness, and hopelessness of that time. Unfortunately, I am reminded of these feelings today, and not only me, when I just look around at the world, what's happening with the world today. Terror in Paris, Crimea annexation, Russian plane shot down by Turkey, refugees, tragedy, nationalism sweeping Europe from Poland to France, and the statements which remind me more about the atmosphere which was characterized by Dr. Strangelove movie rather than modern necessities. The world governance has gone impotent. G7, G20, World Bank, EEC, BRICS, UNESCO, World Economic Forum, and the likes. Dozens of important organizations, dozens of important presidents, thousands of important ministers, millions of spy analysts, CIA, the Russian Federal Security Service, MI6, and so on and on. An incredible financial, industrial, intellectual capacity. They really run the world, but they run it really badly. What went wrong? There are existential, political, and operational reasons. First, I would say it's the degeneration of liberal values. The modern market economy was a natural outgrowth of the rise of liberalism and political democracy in the West. The extension of freedom and democratic rights to every citizen has gradually led to the emergence of economic democracy as well, in which each individual casts monetary votes according to his individual needs and capacity. In the absence of basic human rights, the economic life as we know it today is inconceivable. But the further evolution of this idea has played a trick with civilization. In the consumption-driven world, the people have started to be driven by the belief in economic prosperity as the guarantee of human freedom. Material prosperity has become implicitly related to the extent of individual freedom. Personal well-being gradually has turned from a tool of liberal values into a competing goal, gradually devaluing and marginalizing these values. That is why the threat to the prosperity standards, by the way, leading to this unbridled economic growth of today's system, has started to be seen as erosion of freedom. As a result, the human development, the personal status have become hostages of the economic performance, deforming the basic civilization's ethical matrix. Democracy, with economic issues dominating today parliamentary agendas, has gradually been reduced to an instrument of economic optimization. In the political sphere, the end of the Cold War has paradoxically accelerated this process. After the World War II, many people of the world were attracted by the Western model, by its soft power, its high economic efficiency, rule of law, human rights, turned the democratic system into a shining city on a hill for many, especially when compared to the repressive and economically less efficient models. The socialist system implosion has devalued and erased the stark comparative advantages of the Western political system. Not being able to use anymore the repressive models of the East Bloc as a reference point, the West was challenged to start sweeping in front of its door, to confirm and prove the democratic model moral advantages in its own daily reality. But instead, it has ceded the temptation to establish its gains in the Cold War victory, quickly converting moral principles into geopolitical instruments. The degree of euphoria that swept the ruling elites in the West after the end of the USSR was explicit in Condoleezza Rice's article in Foreign Affairs at that time. I'm quoting, "It's America's job to change the world. democratic state building is now an urgent component of our national interest. Well, as they say, we wanted the best, you know the rest. In many places of the world, including where we are now, the world is still facing the consequences of this democratic state building program. And indeed, after Abu Ghraib, WikiLeaks, it was difficult to expect that people will continue to see a torch of the future in the Western model. But is it worth lamenting about the crisis of democracy? No. I think that we need now to debug and upgrade the democratic mechanisms reflective of the new drivers, uncertainties, and systemic challenges. We have to rescue democracy from being a hostage of traditional geopolitical considerations and banal economic growth concerns. In 10, 15 years, the world will be a totally different place. We're looking at the communications and technology revolutions occurring in a very abbreviated time frame. Soon, billions of people will interact via a fast data transferring meta web, and it will change social standards as well as human behavior patterns. Integrated global economies functioning as a holistic entities will spur a deep reframing of global governance, shaping a new configuration of political, economic, and military power. One can hardly expect that these changes will leave democratic mechanisms intact. So the question, is there a way that we can sync democracy with globalization? How can we enable the democratic decision-making mechanisms at the global level? Since the dawn of the modern democratic era in the late 19th century, democracy has expressed itself through nation states and national parliaments, but globalization has changed national politics profoundly. People today engage in social issues mainly through civil society and the use of social media as their primary tool. This holds fascinating prospects for de facto global citizenship and action, but it does something to the old type of representative democracy. What are the probable outcomes of the evolving new balance of political, economic, and military power shifting the centers of gravity from west to east, from north to south, from nation states to private actors? Will it recreate a new multi-uni-bipolarity of the world, or give birth to a lateral, self-adaptable, and heterogeneous international network instead of traditional states-based system? The present-day social reality reveals new growing and influential actors. Alongside the notorious process of globalization, there is another process that receives much less attention, and that is lateralization. The establishment of vigorous polyphonic groups that benefit from broad access to the IT and communications, financial, organizational, and technological means of post-industrial world. These, I call them asteroid of social universe, include various ambitious corporations like Apple or Uber now, global diasporas, influential NGOs, various think tanks such as Bibliotheca Alexandrina, criminal consortia. All of them make up a new flexible hybrid universe without any formalized sociological cartography yet, but leaving ever-growing footprint on the politics mechanism. And last, IT and communication revolution could change social standards and thus the world order. What will happen to the traditional democracy content elements, political parties, election, representative mechanisms? We never anticipated a technology revolution so extreme in its productivity that it could actually reduce marginal cost of production to near zero for a whole array of goods and services, making them essentially priceless, abundant, and beyond the market. In the last 20 years, we've seen the zero marginal cost phenomenon invade entire sectors of world media, knowledge, and information industry. It's a pivotal moment, not only for the global economy, but now for all of us. We clearly need a new political vision. There was Internet of Information. Then we saw the Internet of Energy because of the feed-in tariffs, the possibility to use P2P system for energy producer and consumer. Even the new term was created, prosumer, producer and consumer in one word, which is happening today. Then we have today Internet of Things. What next? And I can tell you what will be the next. Internet of Politics, with people connected through this network, and that will inevitably archive party politics. Douglas Carswell, a British member of parliament, likens traditional politics to HMV, you know, a chain of British record shops that went bankrupt recently, in a world where people are used to calling up whatever music they want, whenever they want, via Spotify. They don't need this shop anymore. There are big questions about who is going to control the networks, data security, privacy, information transparency, but there is even a bigger one and more fundamental question. What are the long-term goals? What is the meaning of the world development in the 21st century? And the answer to this question will define the future of democracy. Concluding, democracy is not dying. It's evolving. It's much stronger than it looks at the surface. So the democracy can be reset if it can provide a platform for collective judgment and individual development for people in a value-driven process, when values manifest themselves, as Hans has said, in concrete and socially meaningful issues, not reduced to economic optimization and politics of the wallet. Finally, the only remedy that I see for the crisis of democracy is more democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Likotail, for your broad and encouraging vistas of the future. And I think that's what we need. Mr. Jacobs, he is the initiator of the World Academy of Arts and Science, now the executive director. And he has been doing quite many different things, but now he just comes from Chennai, where he has his other activities, during the rain even.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is a very rich, and I think we'll all agree, a very complex discussion. And maybe we've come into this meeting, many of us thinking we already knew that democracy was a complicated thing and there are a lot of issues, and now it's a lot more complicated than it was before. And I'd like to start off with Alexander's last comment that democracy is a process that's in evolution. I'm American. We saw the Declaration of Independence with the Ishmael put up from 1776. Sometimes it's good to remember that about half the signatures on the Declaration of Independence, which said that all men are endowed with certain inalienable rights and so forth, about half of them were slave owners. And when they said men, they really meant white men. They didn't mean women. In fact, my grandmother was a suffragette. Back in American women got voting right only in 1922. After saying all men are created equal, we had to fight a civil war in 1865 and have a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. When I was growing up in junior high school, we had to be bused across town because the Supreme Court was saying that a constitutional amendment wasn't enough to really effectively eradicate the prejudice against blacks in America, and this was an ongoing process. 1964, I landed on the campus of University of California at Berkeley. It was the time of the free speech movement, which was really prompted by the protests against Vietnam War, and a lot of young people wondering, why are we going over there to fight people in countries we don't even know? And a lot of people didn't come back. And where we were questioning, the youth in that time were questioning the very authority and legitimacy of our own government. It may be a democracy, they may have been elected by our parents, but is this really a government that represents the people or represents the principles on which the country was intended to be based? Alexander mentioned the Prague Spring. I happened to be in Prague 1 week before the Soviet invasion in '68, and it was a heart-rending experience to see people who had been so full of energy and hope of a turnaround suddenly being smothered. I landed in India in 1971. I'd been working there for almost 45 years. And there I've seen a country which is purportedly and in some sense rightfully the largest democracy in the world. In most of the regional elections, with some exceptions, the voting goes by caste lines. What are we using this democratic apparatus for? Either the voters are paid to vote or they're offered free TVs and other incentives to vote along certain lines. So definitely democracy, when you see it operating, looks a little different than it did when I read about it in the university. Much more recently in the United States, our Supreme Court, I'm very proud to say, had decided that corporations have the rights, many of the rights of individuals, and they should have the right to spend a good deal of money deciding who should be elected in the United States. And in the most recent elections, campaigns, which some of you are following, there was a comment by at least one, maybe several of the Republican candidates that America is a Christian nation, in spite of the very clear lines of what the founding fathers intended. So this brief narrative was intended to reinforce what Alexander said. In a country that many, rightfully or wrongly, look up to as an epitome of democracy, this is a work in progress. And the comments I'd like to make are to ask something more fundamental, or something broader, and look at this not as a question of whether democracy is a success or a failure, but look at this of the broader challenge that we face in governing our increasingly complex and interconnected human community. What are we trying to accomplish, and what are we trying to accomplish with democracy? I agree very much with what Alexander said, that democracy seems to be, at least up until now, the most successful, effective system we've devised in order to generate wealth and stability for large numbers of people over a long period of time. And that's a tremendous accomplishment. There's no doubt about it. It's a tremendous accomplishment. But what is really happening here? What is it the electoral process? Is it the way we apportion seats? Is it the voting rights that is the factor here? We human beings, we live together in communities, smaller and larger communities, which have tremendous potential. We have knowledge, we have skills, we have technologies, we have organizational capabilities, and all our wealth and all our stability and all the peace that we've managed to create, we have created through a complex social network in which we get people to work together, live together for individual benefit and collect the benefit of the collective. And somehow we found a way, a very crude, rough way of balancing the rights of individuals and the contributions that individuals can make and the rights of the collective. And we're constantly experimenting with how to get that balance better. And we certainly have seen that in societies which recognize those fundamental values that Alexander was mentioning, that we release more energy, more social potential, and get more of some of the results, not all of the results, that people aspire for. In other words, society has a power. We collectively have a power. And we're trying to find out, and in every decade, in every century, in every community, in every country differently, how can we utilize this potential in the most effective way for the benefit of the most people? But that's not all. Within the society, we also have another process that's going on. If this is, I'm calling it the social process, we also have a process which one former president of the World Academy of Art and Science, which I represent, Harold Laswell, called the power process. And the power process is the process that determines how this social potential and the social benefits are distributed in the society. Who gets what? Under old feudal systems or monarchical systems, it was very much concentrated at the top. In America before the Civil War, it excluded whole large communities from any of the benefits of fundamental human rights. And even today we see in almost all cases that the way power is distributed in society is not necessarily determined by the electoral process or what we call democracy. In the US, I feel that we would be doing a service to my own country if we stopped calling America a democracy and we started calling it a plutocracy. And I think we're so proud of being a democracy, and we're much more proud when you come and tell us that we're a democracy. But I think the reality of it is that the power of money and the corporate sector is so influential in deciding how benefits are distributed in the society that at best it's a pseudo-democracy, and we do a disservice to the name. All right, I agree with Alexander. This is a work in process. This is a work in evolution, and rather than throw out the system, let's be aware that being human beings and working together and living together and trying to govern ourselves, difficult to govern even ourselves individually, let alone collectively, democracy has brought us tremendous gains, but we have never seen what this system really should be. And I get a little comfortable when we talk about the system of democracy and the mechanisms of democracy and how the voting is done and all of those things, because I think the real heart of democracy, again, is what Alexander talked about. It's the values. Many of you may be familiar with the book by Fareed Zakaria on the future of freedom. It's a wonderful book that made a very, very simple thesis. the birth and growth and development of what we call modern democracy in the West was preceded by centuries of liberalism, of a cultural development of liberal values with respect for the individual, respect for human rights, respect for property rights, respect for law, long before we had elections. And back in the middle of the 19th century, you have to remember elections in most European countries, including England, you had to have property in order to have a right to vote. It took a long time for us to develop the mechanisms. And Zachariah's theme has been extending the mechanism of democracy without the foundations of the culture, the foundations of the culture of liberalism, creates what he called an illiberal democracy. It can have exactly the opposite effect of what we thought or intended that we were doing. And the US has helped encourage a lot of the founding of a lot of illiberal democracies, and there's a lot of illiberalism in American democracy today. So I think one of the real issues that we need to be discussing here is not how we get the mechanism right, but how do we promote the cultural development that's going to use the power that modern society has in a way that's really beneficial to all. That's a very difficult question. That's not going to be something that we decide in an election or how we craft a constitution. But probably, I think, in the long run, that's going to be a greater determinant of the capacity of democracy to deliver its full potential than getting the mechanism of it right, because any mechanism can be used for good or for ill. So when we come to the discussions in the next few days, I think it's important that we look at the factors that will help build that culture, which is the foundation of democracy. Education, obviously, is a critical factor. It has been critical in the whole evolution of democracy in the West. And I think it's worth exploring what needs to be done and what can be done in the field of education to promote it. I was happy Alexander also mentioned the economic, and several others, the economic issues, because today, what is the value of the right to vote for a young person who doesn't have access to a job? Access to employment today, and access to a job is the economic equivalent to the right to vote. In a market economy, if you don't have a source of income, if you don't have a way of gainful employment, you don't have any rights in the economy. And let's face it, all political systems are founded on an economic basis. I think we have a project in the Academy looking at the problems of economics today and economic theory today. And to give a long story in one sentence, we have the capacity, and not everybody in the Academy agrees with me on this, we have the capacity to create jobs for everybody within a democratic society and within a market economy as well. It's a question as to how power is distributed in that democracy and most importantly, in that economic system. And if we don't get that right, if we don't get a way of ensuring livelihoods for everybody, we're not going to develop and have sustained political democracies. And even where we have them, we're going to see them breaking down after some time and going in all illiberal directions. So I'm arguing that let's not think of democracy as the political part of life. Let's look at it as a core of how we are governing our whole life, economic, social, cultural, political, technological life, and how are we going to harness and utilize the enormous social potential we have. Thank you.
Gary. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we had the right following order in the 4 contributions. And we have come to a kind of general idea that democracy is about values, is about respecting the others, is about giving others also opportunities, not just yourself. It's also much broader. It's not just the political process. And in a way, we are now living in a time where there are many forces working against it. It's the individualization, it's the competitiveness, it's measuring all success in terms of money and economic growth. Those things have to be kind of incorporated or adjusted in a real democratic kind of society. And when we can go in that direction, the democracy that we will have will be much broader, supported by people, as long as we can balance very well representation in different issues and inclusiveness, trying to involve people. Participation is one side. It's the people that want to participate. Inclusiveness is giving the opportunity to participate. And I think that's very important. Well, first we had thought that there would be time for questions, but the speaker, we were all too long. And so it's 2:15, it's time for lunch. And maybe some of you may be
Mr. Chairman, I think we should sort of really open it to the floor, at least for 15 minutes.
Okay,
we'll
it's
be
fine
running
for
late,
me, but you are the organizer.
No, it's okay.
Okay,
Lunch will wait for another 15 minutes for us.
Okay, good. Questions?
President Dahl, President Arteaga, a lot of people want to speak.
I will make a kind of lottery, so it's 1, it's 2, 3.
Okay, all right. 1,
And
2,
we
3.
follow this following order.
Yeah, lottery is working very well. I want only to congratulate all the participants, but I will be very interested that Mr. Licotal answer how to reset democracy, because I like the expression that you use, like how to reset democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question to Dr. Sirageddin I found two very important points relates to the Muslim world in his historical perspective, the Medina Convention and what the third caliph gave as a commitment to non-Muslims, particularly Christians. This first point needs to be elaborated because we're living in a world now where these radicals who speak in the name of Islam denies Christians and Jews to live in our societies, where they are part and parcel and citizens and been living here since centuries. That this point was later on the convention of the third caliph and the prophet's commitments were transferred to a system, a legal system known as a millet system. When the Ottomans conquered Istanbul, they established the Greek Orthodox Church as it was and called this Greek millet. Then they gave the same right to Armenians who were not allowed to live in Constantinople under the Byzantines. They gave the same rights, and then they established the chief rabbi's office for the Jews in Istanbul. And this has been the system all through until the transformation of the Ottoman state under the European influence and the introduction of citizenship from the French legal, modern legal concept. Then you had, under the caliphate, the real caliphate, not a Baghdadi's caliphate, establishment of parliamentarian system. In 1876, there was two chambers, the Majlis Mabusan, the House of Deputies, and the House of Senators, Majlis Ayan, notables. And they were from all through, from European provinces like Kosovo, like Selanik, like Turkish provinces, from Yemen, from Hijaz, from Tripoli, Libya, etc. And this went up twice, one in 1876 and one in 1908. So under the classic Islamic Caliphate system, you have representation and democracy. So
will the
this is an answer to those who say democracy is not compatible with Islam, and Islam is against. So I just wanted to highlight this. Thank you.
That's a good point.
I don't have a question. I just want to comment. I have three commentaries, but you would allow me three of them. So by lottery, I select one. I do think that sometimes we are thinking of this kind of democracy, the Occidental or Western part of democracy, that began in the Jewish culture with free will, went on in Greece, Rome, and Christianity. So it's the Greco-Roman Christian version of democracy, which I don't think can be promoted in other cultures. I strongly recommend a book by Alan Garcia called Confucius, in which he analyzes the possibility of this Western kind of democracy to be imposed or sold to China, for instance. I do think we have a sense of thinking that that is the best democracy for us, but perhaps it cannot be the same in cultural environments that are so different. But one thing I wanted, because Dr. Serageldin was very interesting, but one qualitative change occurred. The Magna Carta begins with the rights of contributors to send representatives that take care of the money. That's the essence. You won't be able to spend my money except when my representatives say so. So landless John was for the first time the executive we tried to stop as a spendthrift. This is the essence of this democracy. But one game change occurred. In a certain time, I think it was in the Roosevelt time of the big government in the United States, there was a role reversal. And the spendthrift became the parliament. And the one that takes care of the money, the executive. All around the different roles at the beginning of the Magna Carta in June of 1215. And we must take into account that because Parliament, and I've been in Parliament and I've been in the executive, nowadays it throws money at problems with a natural sense of irresponsibility, and the old spendthrift is the one that takes care of the money. And we must dwell on that because that is a tremendous change of the roles of democracy. Thank you.
Then first, Professor Likutal for the first question.
Thank you very much for your question. Thank you for your question. First of all, I think that you cannot just take democracy isolated from other big problems of the world. It would be strange if we were talking about climate crisis, economic crisis, water crisis. I don't know what is not a crisis, and there is no crisis with democracy. There is. That's clear. That's like, how to reset it. There is a joke. A patient comes to the doctor and says, listen, everything aches, whatever I touch, it's just painful, aches. The doctor examines the patient and says, well, my dear, but you have a broken finger. So when we are talking about different pains that we have, maybe we have a broken criteria, the finger. Because today we're looking on the world through the positivist, westernized agenda. Everything can be done. Yes, we can. It has become the slogan of, let me say, of the century. Yes, we can, even before thinking what we want to do. It's wrong. You do not solve the problem by just, putting together money, resources, etc. First, you have to think, where is the real problem? And that's what we are not doing today. The real problem is the development model that we are embarked today on. We have to work synergistically in a systemic way. There is no crisis of democracy decoupled of all the other issues. It exists only in our imagination that we can compartmentalize our problems. That's why to reset democracy means to rethink our agenda. Where are we going? That's what I said. We have to decide where are we going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ismail, maybe you would like to make a comment on the second contribution, but answer the third question.
Yes, I will. Thank you. I just want to say something for everybody here. We have been thinking for a while to organize a conference dealing with the prevailing economic model. And this is a very, I'm sorry, because this is an open invitation to everybody, that when we will do that, we'll sometime in the spring of, or late spring of next year, we hope that you will also join us in this. This is a unique moment when the prevailing consensus on economics has been very profoundly shaken. You have very serious top Nobel Prize winning economists who are coming at it from different sides, and there are many, many different views right now out there. The issue of inequality is being posed in a very serious terms, not just in terms of income, but also in terms of concentration of wealth. We have seen the impacts of that on democracy, the 99%, the Wall Street occupation, etc., that we see these movements on. But for our intellectual as well as administrative convenience, we slice up the issues. I mean, everything is connected to everything: demography, social values, sociology, economics, political science. So we focused this particular event on democracy and democratic tools and means, but I think you're all invited to something which we are planning on economics and the challenge of the contemporary 21st century economics, because the world has changed a lot from the time of John Maynard Keynes, who after all made his reputation for writing about the Versailles Treaty. I mean, this has been 100 years now. The world has changed enormously. And the new realities are such that I think we need some profound thinking on that. So I promise you all that we will have some very profound thinking with some very top people on that, but I don't think that we can really tackle it in the context of this. So yes, it's there, and you're absolutely right. Inequality is a fundamental problem. Employment is a problem, etc., etc. Secondly, on the question that, of course, Hakim Al-Din Hassanoglu raised on the Medina contact, is very important, yes, and it's a very important thing to remember that it was a coexistence. And even when later on it turned to war, and the Prophet Muhammad asked the Bani Nadir Jewish tribe to leave, he allowed them to take all their possessions, but not their weapons, but their possessions only, and to leave with their full possessions. They were not disenfranchised of their possessions. So there's a lot of that to be reminded to people. But history goes only so far. I mean, in the end of the day, we need to remind ourselves that it was Saladin who returned the Jewish community to Jerusalem after the Battle of Hattin, because when the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem was there, they had cleansed, religiously cleansed the city of Jerusalem. So that's important, especially in the kinds of debates we have among Muslims, to remind the wayward ones or those who are lost that in fact the real Islam is really very different. I do think, however, the last thing I would like to just come back to is that the general values that we adhere to, whether the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or other such values, need to be protected in a certain system. And invariably, you do better on one thing than you do on the other. Different systems succeed better in certain things than in others. So we need to make choices, and that was the purpose of the little story of the 3 children with the flute. When you say, for example, as they do in the United States, that the situation against blacks has reached a stage which is totally unfair, and you promote, for example, affirmative action, or you come in a country, just in Egypt in 2010, there was a formal quota proposed for women, because when you have only 3% of the parliamentary elections leading to women being members, you have to do something about it. So what do? You say, well, I'll put this quota in place for a certain amount of time. Now, clearly, when you put a quota in place, you are breaking other rules, such as equality before the law, such as et cetera, non-discrimination for a number of things. So there is positive discrimination. But I think that there is no perfection on any system, and the people have to be able to fine-tune the system as they go along. And that requires greater clarity on what it is we're going to put forward. That was the gist of my speech in South Africa. I was asked to give the Mandela lecture in South Africa in 2011, and it was all about the meaning of social justice. Because, as you know, there's an enormous problem in South Africa after decades, if not centuries, of apartheid. The white community versus the black community is so far ahead, and the black community simply accepting the leadership of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu went along for a while, but there's a growing generation of young people who are very dissatisfied and saying, you know, the housing problem has not been solved in Johannesburg, et cetera, et cetera. So what did majority rule bring to me? Where is the result of democratic majority rule? There was an expectation that somehow democracy was going to solve that problem, which is where we come back again to this issue that democracy, in terms of a procedure, an electoral system, can maybe end certain political problems such as discrimination, outright discrimination, but it cannot reset, to use the word reset, it cannot reset the economic terms unless you have sounder economic policies. And therefore, you know, we have these different facets of the problem that I think we need to do, always being aware. I love this example of the broken finger, that we use the right criterion to analyze the right problem.
Thank you very much. Let's thank the speakers for their contribution.